Welcome to this meeting of the Culture, Media and Sport Select Committee. Our first panel this morning will look at solutions to some of the key challenges facing community and grassroots clubs, including around the decline in facilities, funding distribution, the workforce and links with schools. So welcome Sarah Kaye, who is the Chief Executive of Sported. Welcome to Andy Taylor, who's the Chief Executive of Active Partnerships. And welcome to Lisa Wainwright, MBE, the Chief Executive of the Sport and Recreation Alliance. Thank you all for joining us this morning. Before we begin, can I just remind members to declare any interests at the point that they ask their questions. I'm going to kick off, and this is a question to all of you, but what I'll do is I'll start with you actually, Sarah, please. The funding landscape for community sport is very fragmented. It's quite difficult to navigate. Are there better ways of doing this? Is there a better way that funds can be distributed more effectively?
Yeah, I mean, certainly, and I think it's important to emphasise that I will be giving the perspective of the community groups that Sported support across the UK. To just give you a bit of insight, we support around 5,000 community groups across all regions and nations in the UK who are reaching in turn up to 1 million young people in some of the most deprived and underserved communities. And if you look at it's important to emphasise the profile of the types of groups that we work with. We have, within the Sported network, 2/3 are entirely volunteer-led, a third have an income of less than £10,000, and most of these groups, it's fair to say, are sat outside of traditional structures. So what I mean by that is 60% don't work with sporting councils, 40% don't work with NGBs. So these are organisations who are using sport intentionally to deliver social outcomes, not purely sport for participation. They are having a significant impact within the communities that they serve. But these are the organisations that are often overlooked. So a great example of game-changing community organisations in the heart of the most deprived communities. The challenge that our groups have is funding is often, the way that the funding mechanisms work and funding is structured, is funding is often going to the same groups, the same more established groups who, I'm not saying they don't need the funding, but are more sustainable. It's not reaching those that need it the most, the small volunteer-led groups that we talk about who are using sport as a key intervention. They are often overlooked by the system. So I think it's really emphasising the point that the model doesn't reach all, and these small volunteer-led community organisations need the recognition that they deserve. And when we run surveys with these groups, over 90% of them want us to encourage funders to make applications easier. So two, I guess, really important considerations to highlight here is we need to ensure that in the funding model, we are using the right networks and mechanisms to ensure that these community groups are not overlooked. How do we bridge the gap between funders and these target audiences? But just as importantly, and I think this is fair to say for the broadening funding landscape, how do we reduce the complexity of the funding process? There's a real need to reduce the administrative burden. There's a need to simplify the process and have lower barrier funding opportunities for these types of community groups. And just to bring that to life a little bit, so the organisations that we work with, they are often overlooked because of one of two reasons. They find it really difficult to articulate the phenomenal work that they do. They may not have the necessary governance in place, or a combination of the two. So how do we bring a lighter touch approach to funding applications? And one example would be, and we're not the only advocates of this, bringing video applications for funds, which better than a clinical form will really personalise the phenomenal work that these community groups do. But there's also there's a need, and a great example of this would be in the summer with the race riots, when there was a need at pace to get funding out to the groups worstly affected by that. An example being a partnership with Sported in the London Marathon Foundation, where at pace we recognised the need, and through our collective networks we targeted the groups most affected by this, but we took a very, very light touch approach to reaching those groups, and it's ensuring that the funds are reaching the groups or essentially the funding is used for the purposes for which it is intended, but at the same time taking a really light touch approach to ensure that those who have the greatest need are essentially being reached.
Thank you. Andy, how do you think the application process could be improved?
Yeah, just building on in terms of what Sarah's just raised, there are some really good examples. During COVID, there was the Together Fund, which was developed at pace. It was with communities on the ground. The Active Partnership Network, as well as other partners in the room today, played a critical role to support those community groups and organisations to apply for funding. And the data and statistics show that community groups who didn't normally apply got access to that funding, which were the areas of inequalities that needed it the most. And I think that's really important, is it's not just about the amount of funding, it's how we join up funding and how we ensure that it is those communities that need it the most gain access to that funding. So we took away all the bureaucracy, took away a lot of the processes at a time when we needed to. How we ensure that we take that learning and the strengths from that to build it for the future, I think is absolutely critical. A couple of other areas as well is around the place investment that's taking place at the moment through Sport England. There's around £250 million that's going into places, into communities. It's a new approach. It's looking at the whole system. It's looking at that place-based working. But we have been given the time and space through our Active Partnership Network and other partners, local authorities and others, to again work with communities to develop the solutions. It isn't one solution for all. It isn't this is what you have, this is top down, it is bottom up. And I think the sector very much is aligning with that. We now need the investment processes to enable that youth voice, enable that community engagement, and then actually we can maximise the impact. The only other one bit he touched around the fragmented, which I would agree with, it's actually understanding what is the vision we're working towards as well. There are times across government and other departments where there'll be funding streams that come out and then something else will follow 2 weeks later. Or a little bit longer. How do we pull that together more coherently with a common purpose? Will enable us to actually be really efficient and effective. There is a challenging fiscal environment. We understand that. So we've got to have maximum impact with the funding that goes into communities and take away as much of the bureaucracy, I suppose, as possible.
Lisa, what do you think? What's the best way of making sure that the funding streams are made as simple and accessible as possible?
I think similar to Sarah's comments is thinking about the end user, and in this debate we're talking about local community clubs run by volunteers who are very busy, having challenges post-COVID in terms of reduction in the number of volunteers at a local level. We know a third dropped out and there's 2 million less volunteers in relation to the sector over the last 6 years, and notwithstanding it costs them to contribute towards their local community clubs in all your constituencies. But I think in terms of the funding landscape, it's really easy when you're in it to understand it. It is very difficult when you're out of it to understand it. So within the funding that's available, you will know there's exchequer and lottery funding to the tune of £250 million a year. Local authorities contribute about £1 billion. The governing bodies in relation to the voluntary code of conduct in relation to broadcast contribute 198 million back into their own sports. And likewise, you may be aware of the Community Amateur Sports Club scheme that started in 2002, which is about supporting local grassroots clubs who are serving their community but reducing burdens on them. Now that contributes around 40 million a year to grassroots clubs. That's about £5,000 per local community club. So I think to answer your question, it's getting back to the end user. How do we utilise a language that they understand in their community? Sport England have recently consolidated all their awards into a movement fund, but the word movement may not speak to a local basketball club and a netball club or a table tennis club or Sported. And it's how do we find a way to be able to communicate in a way that is not threatening nor divisive in relation to those community groups. So as Sarah said, whether that's video applications or one scheme that's worked incredibly well with a private company is where, and it's slightly different because it's not government funding, a private company will go visit local community clubs. And if they see the whites of the eyes of that community club, then they will look to fund it because they believe in the volunteers that they're there to do the right thing, which the majority of volunteers are definitely there to do. And there aren't as many risks and regulations on obviously private funding compared to government funding. But that system has worked incredibly well with a close relationship with a private organisation and local community sports, and that's around Leicestershire, Manchester and Cornwall. So I agree the funding landscape is complicated, and we need a clearer system of communication right down to the 100,000 plus grassroots sports clubs in all our communities.
And talking about that, getting that private funding in, Sarah, you've got experience involving businesses in funding sports initiatives. How can the government attract more and encourage more investors into these sectors?
Yeah, I mean, I think the challenges and solutions are twofold. One is awareness, and the other is creating the right incentives. We know there's a finite amount of money within the sector that we're often competing for, and we have a collective responsibility to leverage funding from outside of the sector. And I think a really interesting, sort of scary statistic we've identified is that if you think about the billions of pounds worth of private sector investment that's going into sports sponsorship, it's enormous. And yet, sadly, only 0.5% of corporate CSR investment is going into sport for development. Now, we don't believe that's not because they don't care. I think they're not making the connection into community support. And for people like me, I spent 20 odd years in the private sector recently into the third sector. For me coming in, the deprivation and poverty and the volunteer-led community groups that are supporting these communities, I think the extent of that is not well understood. Definitely not well understood. And if it was, I think there would be a greater appetite to invest more. So I think there's an awareness piece. Collectively, government, the sector, how do we do a better job of advocating the role of community sport in driving social change, but also then having the right incentives in place to invest more. So, there are well-known tax incentives for social investment, but they need to go beyond the CASC scheme, which is essentially business relief for community groups themselves. What we need to do now is directly incentivise the private sector through tax relief, through match funding, to incentivise them when they've got big budgets to channel more of that into CSR. And the Barclays Community Football Fund that we run is a great example of that. That is run by their sponsorship team that started as an initiative to connect the brand to the heart of communities. That has evolved into a major social impact programme where they're essentially getting a double return. They're delivering their sponsorship objectives but also delivering against their CSR objectives. So how do we incentivise more of that investment and build the awareness?
What was it you think that was the point at which that deal was clinched? What was the clinching point for that?
I think that there are motivations early on, and is demise of the high street. How do Barclays do something meaningful to connect the Barclays brand into the heart of communities? And we have, with the 5,000 community groups, they are based across all regions of England. So we've got sort of the mechanism and the reach to enable them to do that. But as the partnership evolved, they saw they appreciated my point earlier around the lack of awareness about the scale of poverty and deprivation and the role that these community groups play. As the partnership evolved, they recognised the power of that partnership could have in doing more, to rather than simply have access grants to keep the door open, deep impact grants focused on getting more young people with disabilities involved in football, more people from ethnically diverse communities, who, particularly girls who had never participated in football. It opened their eyes to a completely different world, and that partnership has evolved into something much, much more with a much stronger social impact lens. And we've been on a journey with them. How do we do a better job at essentially promoting that type of programme to the wider private sector?
That's really helpful. Thank you very much. Let's move on to Paul, please.
Thanks very much. We've just mentioned funding, but just as important as funding is obviously the lack of adequate facilities and access to adequate facilities. There's lots of challenges for the sector, obviously, from facility management to council budgets and council procedures. Just can I ask each of you in turn, what you think are the solutions to some of those challenges. I mean, Sarah, in particular, you mentioned how important the small grassroots groups are. Certainly in my constituency in Rochdale, there's a group called the Bangladeshi Arts and Sports Association that does fantastic work doing exactly what you say, getting those disadvantaged groups, those underrepresented groups into things like football, and yet they face lots and lots of barriers in terms of facilities. What do you think would be the best solutions?
Yeah, I mean, I'm probably stating the obvious when I say that the issues are twofold. One, availability, and secondly is affordability. In the surveys that we run with our groups, the two challenges have evolved through COVID, but the two that are top of the list always are funding and facilities, the two of which are often directly interlinked. But 57% of our groups say they need more school facilities to be available and at a more affordable rate. The issue that we have so I guess it's how do we through various mechanisms at local authority level entice schools who have the facilities to be open after school hours. There are, as I understand it, really about 50% of secondary schools that don't utilise the facilities after hours, but where they are being utilised, there is a massive competition for inventory, and often the better financed venues, generally football, are securing those venues at the expense of those putting vital provisions for the deprived and underserved communities. So where the provisions are being utilised, local authorities, we would look and hope that they could find a way of managing the demand, and essentially a solution to that could be subsidising schools and leisure facilities to prevent the facilities from always going to the highest bidder. There's a fundamental difference between a football club who can more than afford a rate of £50 an hour versus the community groups that we serve, who charge no membership fee to the community groups that they serve, where they're providing provisions that's life-changing.
Andy?
Yeah, thank you. I'm going to go upstream slightly more. I think one of the biggest challenges are in your area of Rochdale, we will not know right now what is the full facility stock and usage and availability. And by full facility stock, I talk about there is local facility football plans. So Football and Football Foundation will understand what facilities are available there, what the deficit is. There are some playing pitch strategies, some that are live, some up to date across the country, some that aren't. But actually, have we got the public, private sector, the gyms, the leisure facilities, the education facilities in a really hyper-local area? If we even go down to a neighbourhood level, that is where our interventions need to take place. But we need to understand what is that full facility stock. So, yeah, we would certainly, and I spoke recently with GM Moving and your active partnership in your area about actually we need to be able to coordinate and connect that as much as possible, which then means when interventions come down, more than likely, then we can be really aligned and strategic with where investment goes and work to tackle inequalities. And that is really at the heart of what I believe is needed. It is going to be those communities, those individuals who are either inactive or those community sports groups who cannot afford to pay that need access to these other facilities. And we need to then wrap around both the funding question and the facility stock to be able to put a tangible solution in place to support them.
Lisa, we'll talk in more detail about schools, but what are the other solutions in terms of facilities, availability and the fact that they're inadequate at the moment?
Sure. I mean, we know from local authorities they're struggling in terms of developing essential leisure services. We know from our own research at these sport and recreation lines that 3/4 of clubs need more access to public facilities. So this is your badminton, your netball, your table tennis sports that use sports hall facilities. And 2/3 of them are stating that they need more access to school facilities, which we'd heard through Sarah, and I'm sure we'll come on to. We know also that where there are facilities from the ONS in 24, where there are facilities, surprise, surprise, more people take part in sport. So it's a very simple correlation. I think in terms of solutions, we are very much aware in relation to the fiscal measures at this moment in time, but we would really want to protect the exchequer funding in terms of facility provision at this moment in time. So capital funding for build across the sector. I think what we could use in terms of solutions for the future, a lot of our members are larger governing bodies, and you've heard about football, but the ECB have used a fantastic scheme up in Bradford in relation to a dome and inside dome. And the intention was to try and generate the local community to utilise the facility in all its means. It's very innovative, and drive 10,000 people through. And in the first year, 20,000 people went through that facility, and that was through investment for the ECB and the local authority. I think we need to see more schemes that are utilising some of the bigger sports, and don't get me wrong, some of the smaller sports could do this as well with investment. But I think the model exists in terms of driving from a community level, building a different type of facility for that community and getting the rewards. I think one of the other key things that I'd need to raise is in relation to increasing participation. You need more facilities, and we're deeply concerned around the potential removal of Sport England as a statutory consultee for planning. This could jeopardise existing and future sporting provision in all our local communities. It goes without saying that if we can minimise tax and regulatory burdens, it will be easier for particularly our members, national governing bodies, to be able to invest some of their income into developing and supporting communities. But we have to recognise that NGBs can contribute towards that, and that might be skateboard in England, as it's a different model, as well as, I say, some of the bigger sports. But I think what is critical is where there are facilities that are affordable, that are accessible, they will be used with the right motivators driving people towards them.
And to just follow up on the planning point, do you and Andy have any views on whether or not a council should have a statutory responsibility not to release land necessarily for housing, but to protect it for sporting facilities?
Yes, locally we need to protect. So yes, there needs to be some statutory responsibility in the system. I think we do recognise, I'll just add my weight to Lisa's, we have real concerns across our network around that potential decision making. We know there's a consultation process. We hope to be engaged with that as other partners do. How do we create a system which has accountability and ensures that we protect? If we lose those green spaces, we will have huge issues. And just to add one other thing as well, it's also new sites. So we talked about schools, actually new school sites. How do we ensure we work with the housing minister and other departments to ensure that new sites that are built cater for sport and physical activity? That's a real opportunity that we must grab. Otherwise, we don't include it in the policy, we're going to have an issue.
You all talked about schools. The last government had the Opening School Facilities Fund. Can I ask you, Andy, in particular, how Active Partnerships handled that, and what worked about that programme and what necessarily perhaps didn't work and you'd like to see change in it?
Yeah, I think it covers a couple of the questions we talked about before around funding and facilities and what works to be successful. It was a consortia partnership with then 43 active partnerships working locally with partners such as StreetGames, who you'll talk with today. The numbers that were set out from government and the contract, we've over-delivered on more, over 300,000 young people being connected through the initiative. Where we've really seen the success is when the school has been part of the community, and we've been able to, through the local capacity building, ensure that it is a whole community approach to the role that school plays. So we've seen new cricket nets put up, we've seen, which have then been accessed by local cricket clubs. We've seen a lot of SEND programmes, which has probably told us where the needs are within schools at this moment in time. There have been challenges with it. We had 3 months to roll out the first year, which was a challenge. We had to recruit 1,500 schools and submit multiple plans, that many plans in 6 weeks. If we want to embed youth voice, like we talked about earlier in funding, we need to create the conditions to enable that youth voice so that local decision making is made. We were hoping to work with government to evolve opening school facilities to be part of what we talked about today, of that wider community facility stock. So how do we ensure that we join it up and ensure that schools are sustainably open? There is the appetite. That's what we hear from schools. We see a lot of trust partnerships working now, having an external view as well as an internal view. But unfortunately now that capacity disappears in the next couple of weeks and is taken away. And I expect in the future this will come out again, that we need another initiative that rolls out for community schools, because it is an obvious one, an obvious gap. So yeah, it's frustrating a little bit that we weren't able to evolve it. There's been a lot of learnings from it, and I hope that those learnings can be used in the future in terms of what school sport provision looks like moving forwards.
And in terms of the appetite of schools, obviously lots of us have schools in our areas that are effectively shutting off their facilities, the publicly funded facilities, to the community. Yet we understand schools obviously face their own pressures. You've managed to set out under the OSF programme some answers to those schools who've got worries. They're worries about cost, they're worries about, well, if I'm a PFI school, what happens? And yet you've found some answers. You do have PFI schools that take part. You do have schools that don't charge the earth and work with not-for-profits. Do you think that the learnings from those could actually be put to government to say, look, we need a new form of scheme of this?
Yeah, I think what was critical, you need local capacity. Because actually, if you have local capacity that goes and works with schools, works with communities, you're doing a lot of the legwork for them. And then you are connecting the sports clubs into that school. There is the appetite. We worked with, I say, 1,600 schools, higher areas of deprivation, purposely targeted through the investment across the whole of the country. And we want to, hopefully, to evolve that further. But the appetite is 100% there from schools. We haven't had any schools, really, that we've approached about opening school facilities and they've turned around and said, we don't want our school to be open for our community. I don't think that is true. I think they want the support, but we need to recognise the time of the staff isn't there that it was previously. They don't have the capacity, so we need to provide efficient capacity that can look at the community as a whole to provide those solutions.
And just for the other two witnesses, any solutions that you've seen over the last couple of years that actually you think really work in terms of persuading schools, if you want to be part of your community, then making sure your sports facilities are opened up to the community is an essential part of what they're about, and that it's often seen as an add-on for a school. It's a secondary purpose. The main purpose is for education, but should it be a central purpose for these schools to share the community facilities?
Completely. It's appalling that 45% of state schools will not open their facilities to the community. I just find that a shocking stat, quite frankly, when they are there to serve the community, because the children in those schools come from those communities. So absolutely. I think the challenge has always been the worry of what does that mean, as you talked about in terms of PFI. What are the risks on us as a school? So in terms of some of the examples where I'd bring to you, we know that over the last few years, 500 swimming pools have closed. If we are going to get young people to be able to swim, to live, to survive, as well as compete and enjoy time in a pool, we have to change that. And a number of school pools have closed because of maintenance costs, not fit for purpose, etc. I think in terms of working with schools, and a number would want to do this from a primary feeder through to secondary provision and community in totality, is where we can model that over the longer term. So an example in Northamptonshire, where a school is about to close its pool, of look longer term in terms of the investment into that pool. So a fully refurbed pool in one secondary school that can service all those needs, this is a full refurb, is just under 4 million, which over a 25-year period, with a group of young girls, of 1,800 girls in that community who want to learn to swim and enjoy swimming, that's not a significant investment nor risk for that school. The governors may feel differently, but that's the kind of model that we need to work through and then use as good case studies with Swim England, who are doing a huge amount of work, presenting over 80% of the learning in school pools is through Swim England, not through the teachers because of the technical abilities of them.
Oh.
Yeah, I mean, just to add, I think that there's an educational piece around there just to really emphasise to school teachers and those who are managing the school facilities of the benefits and merits of opening up the facilities to the wider community. And I think sentiment similar to the discussion on the corporate piece is do they truly recognise the value that will add within the local community?
Yeah, thank you.
Thanks, Paul. James?
Just on the point of the underserved and the use of capacity that is dormant but not used, is a lot of that the challenge of the school and the requirement for a kind of critical mass of interest from outside of the school to justify opening hours, to justify the cost. And some of the costs that you cover include the man hours required to open up a school facility. And is that more common? Did it used to be the case? Could it be again?
When we're working with primary schools, especially, the cost doesn't come in as a huge conversation. Initially, it's actually, there is the appetite there to work with communities, but the schools now don't necessarily have someone from a sporting perspective that is their remit. So they need that support. to understand what is the art of possible. How do we engage with local clubs and communities? Because the school is such a safe place for outside of school hours. It often is for those children and those parents to say, actually, we can open the schools a couple more hours. Usually those schools are open for after-school clubs anyway. So it isn't necessarily about opening it again. And there are volunteers who can use school sites for local community football clubs, local community cricket clubs, depending on what the facilities they are. So yeah, the feedback we're having is not necessarily being the cost driver. What the Opening School Facilities programme has done, it's initial costs to get the facility fit for purpose, whether that's a booking system or whether that's a lock on the door or whatever it actually is to help with that. Which then means they then go and engage with the communities. But it's that broader picture, where do we want to be long term? We want schools to be part of communities. So it's got to be that bit of a long-term plan that it isn't one golden bullet which is going to suddenly mean they get to there. But actually, if we embed the school within the community, and that's what we're seeing through the place-based work that we're now working through with communities, is you're having all the partners around the table. So they're talking to health, they're talking to transport, and we're looking at the whole system rather than necessarily just looking at it from a school perspective. And then the resource will often follow, even from a local perspective, to add that value.
Thank you. I mean, just talking about facilities more broadly, not just specifically within schools, but going back to what we were discussing about the additional challenges. The government on Friday announced £100 million in additional funding for the multi-sport grassroots facilities programme. Is that the cavalry coming over the hill? Is that going to solve the problems that you've articulated, Lisa?
Yeah, I think any additional investment into facility provision is great, and the Premier League Football Foundation's contribution of £100 million is super. But there is more to be done. I think in terms of what does that mean for the sector, you talked about the complexity of funding models. It's another announcement of another funding stream. What we actually need is a financial framework across it all. So we understand from a strategic point of view what's the long-term investment across both revenue and capital for sport and recreation and physical activity. And so we really welcome the investment. What a number of our members would say is that is specifically around football. I know 40% is around multi-sport, but there are a number of other sports that would want to get involved in developing their facilities. I mentioned a few earlier in terms of the bigger sports. So yes, it's welcome, but I don't believe it is the cavalry coming over, because I think there are some bigger issues we might need to face in relation to absolutely local facilities that are much broader. And that might be in relation to our green spaces we talked about earlier, and also our blue spaces that you will know in terms of the quality of water. The Clean Water Sport Alliance have been driving this campaign forwards to say that 16% of waterways are only rated as good or above good. That's not good enough for a number of our water sports and local clubs. So it's a great investment, Chair, but it needs to be within a framework that we can understand across the totality of sport, leisure, physical activity.
Okay, that's really helpful. Did you want to add to that, Andy?
Yeah, if I can.
Like you look like you're
I'm going to come
keen
up
to
with
say
that one,
something,
if that's
which
all right.
we encourage that. Yeah.
We're involved in that with the Football Foundation, Sport England and the FA, and our role is to ensure there's community engagement. And I think real credit to the Football Foundation and partners around that is that this isn't a top-down application process. This is ensuring community engagement is embedded from the outset. So our partnerships will work locally with those community grassroots clubs and organisations to ensure that is in place and ensure that multi-sport isn't just an add-on. It is part and parcel of those plans which is needed. So I think we're very fortunate to have a number of football bodies that come together that is now looking at how it invests in communities. And I think the way the Football Foundation are investing, there's play zones that are now taking place across the country, which are the heart of communities. That's a real step. It isn't just about a full-size 3G pitch with floodlights that ends up on the suburbs and the outside of cities. This can be at the heart of the cities, which is exactly what we need. But you're right, going back to my earlier point, that will deliver one part of the facility stock. What about those community groups? What about those swimming pools? Let's try and get that whole holistic view of what is available.
Okay, that's helpful. Thank you. We're going to move on to Jo now, please.
Yes. Hello. I represent the best rugby league town in the country.
Brave.
The mighty Lee Leopards. But I know how important that is for that to filter down into our grassroots clubs, and we've got some amazing facilities with regards to that. But the strength of that is obviously its workforce and volunteers. And across the board and across all our sporting sectors, and we know that's a problem. And obviously I think it was the Sport England data that stated volunteer numbers are going down, and Lisa, you alluded to that earlier. So what initiatives or campaigns could help increase the level of volunteers and coaches entering and staying into the sector? Lisa and Sarah.
Sure. Fantastic that you've got the best club in the country. Just to say, obviously, I mentioned earlier, 2 million less volunteers in the last 6 years. It is not surprising given COVID and cost of living. I think that is one of the barriers in relation to people's time is precious and they found other things to do, and it is expensive to volunteer. From our research at the Alliance, we've seen an increase of 25% in the amount of admin for volunteers, so the local secretary or president of the rugby league clubs and others, but that's not translated in a 25% increase in participation. So what I'd talk through, and it's obviously important today to talk about this, is about the regulation and legislation around local clubs. So today, in relation to Martin's Law, we are very supportive and positive about the introduction of Martin's Law, and we've worked very hard in developing that to ensure that the burdens on volunteers are proportionate, particularly around the standard tier, moving from 100 to 200 people and having some exclusions around some of the activities, outdoor activities that might include. Likewise, in terms of the mandatory reporting, in terms of the police and crime bill, we want to ensure that the implications of that being implemented again, that we absolutely agree with in terms of protections, but doesn't become another burden, another piece of work, another legal responsibility for Joe as the volunteer running that rugby club, because that's the worries that volunteers have as they take on more responsibility. I'll have to report this to the local authority, I'll have to report it to the police, I am accountable for this. So I think where the solution should be is wherever we are looking to bring in proposed legislation or regulation, that we should be seen as an absolutely consultee on that point in relation to volunteers. And I'm delighted to say, as I say, Martin's Law have been involved in that, and we'd welcome more involvement with the Home Office in relation to mandatory reporting. The other thing, I think, in terms of reducing those burdens, is to ensure that when legislation regulation comes in, there's an annual or regular review of that. So as it comes through, we might find there's absolutely no implications on volunteers, or we might find this is absolutely, holding their hands behind their backs in terms of moving forward. So that would be the legislation regulation side of things. And I think, coming back to volunteers, they don't have a huge amount of time. They have lives to lead as well. We have to remember that any guidance that we produce to volunteers and with volunteers is clear, it's consistent, and it's simple to apply. Too many times I think we've allowed many of our 100,000 sports clubs to write their own policies, and I think it's time to have a consistent suite of examples of where that can come in. It worked incredibly well in the introduction of GDPR a few years back, where we had a consistent suite of support, and I think that's where we can do a much better job in terms of supporting the 98% of volunteers that are out there running community sport.
Fantastic, thank you. And the same question to Sarah. So campaigns that we could keep our volunteer base, but also then as well, as a separate question, what else could government do?
Yeah, I mean, just to sort of re-emphasise Lisa's point, it's a bit like the funding landscape, make volunteering easier. There's a massive requirement to ease the administrative burden, whether it be volunteers at board level or volunteers in the front line putting on provisions. They're well intended but extremely time poor. From research with our groups, 40% of groups say they want to work with government on social issues, but 9 out of 10 are excluding themselves because of the admin burden. So reduced bureaucracy will directly lead to an increase in capacity. The other areas are, I think there's a role that government can play in enhancing the value of volunteers, volunteering, particularly for young people. Is just as valuable as doing work experience, but not necessarily recognised in the same way. And we feel government can play a bigger role in promoting the benefits of career development and personal development, and creating forms of accreditation, for example. I think there is an opportunity to do more, almost a double benefit of investing more in funded programmes into community groups that benefit young people, but also inspire them to then become volunteers. So something we've done effectively with some of our corporate partnerships is one of the big areas our community groups focus on, given they're focusing on young people in deprived areas, is providing them with life skills to essentially then go on and into the wealth of benefits that come with that, going into full-time employment. But programs we run are young leaders programs that serve that purpose, but what they're also doing is recruiting young people who are the beneficiaries of the work that these community groups do, who then stay on for a period of time, or in some cases almost permanently, as volunteers within the local communities, doing that vital work in the long term. I think there's also the opportunity, thinking about investment pots, to say, where are there gaps? So coaching is a really good example of where there's a shortage of coaches everywhere across all regions and all nations. And an example in the Barclays Community Football Fund, one of the biggest barriers to getting young girls in sport is not having enough female coaches. And one of the programmes that we've launched, identifying the need, is attracting females, giving them the confidence but also the level 1 accreditation to become coaches. And this is actually in contrast to many volunteers who are very time poor. This is often, many of the coaches that we have given accreditation to are mums who aren't time poor, who would never historically have even thought or entertained about volunteering, who now have the confidence, motivation to do the accreditation and actually get involved. So it's it's the double benefit of utilising funded programmes to attract that talent pool and bringing them in.
Right, thank you.
Could I just add, it's just a reflection, in 2005, a while back now, the Home Office had the Year of the Volunteer, and for each month of the year there was a focus on a particular technical area, whether it be caring or sport, etc. But it was a fantastic campaign at the time, and it may be worth re-looking at some of the outcomes from that campaign. But what it did was elevate the level of a volunteer, and it brought the voluntary sector and sport together. So it's always been seen a little bit separately. There were coaches, we're referees, technical officials, but it brought both the voluntary sector, as I say, and sport together. So it might be re-looking at some of the outcomes from that. The other thing that made it even better was there was investment into national governing bodies with volunteer leads, and those volunteer leads led recruitment programmes through all the sports. There were 35 sports involved in that. So, forgive me, it's a while back, but there are stats from that particular campaign that worked really well.
Thank you.
Thank you, Rupert.
Yeah, it was just a related one, and I think you've a bit answered it, but I think all the research shows, you said that the number of volunteers is shrinking, but also that they're a narrow sort of category of people anyway, from higher socio-economic backgrounds, and you said, Sarah, that it's very undiverse. Any other ideas for sort of getting a wider range of people? I think the researchers said lack of role models, language barriers, lack of IT skills to find out what's going on. I don't know what...
I think the priority...
Sort this?
Yeah, I mean, the priority with recruitment should be, particularly when you're talking about community groups in the heart of the community groups that we serve, is that we are recruiting people with lived experience from those local communities. That should be the priority, because in theory it's easier recruitment, the retention levels will be higher, and they are better qualified than anybody to understand the challenges within communities.
One of the challenges we've seen straight away from the place investment rollout that's taking place across 80 places across the country at this moment in time, especially those hyper-local, is a lack of capacity locally with community groups and organisations. So really local neighbourhoods, really local communities. So part of the work we're doing at the moment is working from that bottom-up approach. It's rather than dropping in an activity, it's working to build up with community groups. Who are these leaders in the future? Who can actually build the capacity? Because we know in certain parts of the community you need those role models. You need people from that community, and that's what becomes sustainable. And I think that's what we see now up and down the country. There's a better understanding of that, but it will take time. But what I will say is I think the sector is starting to do that. It's really well placed. It recognises it. It understands the conditions that are needed locally to really move the dial, both in moving inactivity to becoming active, but also looking at inequalities lens, and whatever that inequalities lens is, whether it's participation or workforce.
Is it different for different sports? Because I know we've got Trailfinders Rugby in Ealing, and actually they've had difficulties going up a league because their facilities aren't good enough. However, they also think that people perceive rugby to be a bit of an elitist public school thing. Could different sports do stuff? Because everything's word of mouth and then it just replicates.
I mean, in terms of rugby, they've got the RFU have got an absolutely fantastic programme at this moment in time. It's called Rugby School Managers. There's 40 managers going outreach into different schools and communities. And their ambition over the 4 years is to have 100 of those, because you're right, if you're in the environment that there is a rugby club that has got outreach work, so you're fine, but if you're not, that's what's been missing. So I think in terms of getting more people from the local community with lived experience into the different roles. I know the next session is around particularly sport for development charities, and Sported is one of them, is they have really done a superb job. So Coach Corps being one of them, Sported being another one, in terms of modelling building confidence, building teamwork, etc. It's the skills for life that will build the next community of volunteers. It then comes through a protected system. You don't want to put somebody into a secretary of a club, as an example, with all the risks on that. But what it's starting to do is build those skills within young people, within their communities. And a little bit like football, and we talked about rugby, you have an affinity with your local area or your club, and that will build that affinity that will give back, because you'll be part of it moving forward. So I think in terms of the next session, it might be worthwhile just pulling some examples from there.
Thanks.
Thank you, Rupa. Let's move on to Damien, please.
Thank you. Can we come back to talking about working with schools? So, I think it's probably worth saying, I don't know if you'd agree, but some of the national governing body programmes are like 10 times better than they used to be when, like, I was growing up. It's like night and day. But some work better than others. And I'd be interested in your thoughts on one of the kind of success factors. Maybe Andy might start on that, but then maybe if we go to Sarah to talk about individual local groups, local clubs, and what are the success factors for them being able to work with schools. Schools quite often say they're dying to work with clubs in the community, but for some reason the connection just doesn't happen. And any of the three of you could comment probably on any of those aspects, but particularly thinking about, we're trying to make recommendations here, particularly to government and to some extent to the kind of larger organisations for actual policy change. Andy, do you want to start?
Yeah, thank you, Damien. I know we sat in the task force together, and this is a topic which we talked about quite a lot. Our network will often look at it from two lenses, and it's not the whole lens, because obviously sport and progressing that way is absolutely critical, but we will often look at it from an inequalities but a whole school approach to tackling physical activity. So if we are looking at children who are inactive, we know to start with it needs to be movement. And it needs to be actually walking to school, it needs to be playing in the playground, it needs to be an active school day. So how do we embed that from a policy and leadership perspective through then naturally into sport? And once they're more active, then they may step into sport. But the sport isn't necessarily the starter point for many. But then when people are active and wanting to play sports, you're right, how do we have national governing bodies? And we do, there's national governing bodies, and you're right to mention it, have moved a huge long way and are working locally more and more. Some can't work as locally, they don't have the infrastructures. So how do we work with other partners and other organisations to really listen to young people? Genuinely listening to young people is critical. We've done it before where we will have one conversation, right, okay, well, that's the result, that's the answer. Sitting down with young people, letting them understand what is the art of possible, recognising for some children it may be different. So we have some great examples in Bradford at the moment, the local delivery pilot there called Jump. It's been funded since 2018. They have 15 work streams across their community, one being their Creating Active Schools framework. And that is very much using physical activity to the drive, and where sport and PE then wrap around that. And then it brings partners into that joined up system to go, actually, we can actually create solutions here. And that is bucking the trend from the Active Lives data, because for that reason that it is joined up. So, yeah, I think it's actually understanding how all these different parts interconnect. I think one of the challenges around schools, and you'll know this more than anyone, is we talk about PE, school sport, physical activity in one conversation. Mm-hmm. I think the challenge is the solutions are different for each area, all absolutely critical, and they all have to interconnect. But we need to recognise they are different. An example in Bradford again is a lot of Asian young girls in schools. The word sport will put them off, so actually how do we engage them with something different? And it needs to be just the girls on their own in a certain environment, and then we build the confidence, then they're ready to then step into that wider sport, because sport provides those wider societal outcomes.
And this is specific to school facilities?
To working with schools, and sometimes that does mean using school facilities, but sometimes it means getting the kids out of the school to come to the club, or it means doing things before school, after school, generally working in partnership.
Yeah, I mean, I guess one of the value and benefits with Sport for Development is across the multitude of organisations, we work collaboratively and are truly embedded in the regions. And I think although you could potentially have a one-size-fits-all, I think that the challenges that are faced at local level and the solution to those will often vary from region to region. What's great is we have feet on the ground that are well connected, and community groups and other organisations are very, very well placed to pick up create the provisions at local level. I think the challenge is who forms the conduit there, and in between, and does that vary?
You should. So I guess that's my question. How do you make it happen?
Well, I think the obvious answer to that is local authority and local councils, and having a facilitator or an individual who takes that responsibility and is the conduit, so that it gets the dialogue going with the local schools. That what you will have absolutely no shortage of within any region across the UK is that collaboration, the local knowledge, the connection with community groups to make it happen. It's just how we take a more formalised and joined up approach across all regions.
And Andy, your organisation does some of that itself, right? Do you want to unpack that a little bit?
Yeah, very much so. And Energise Me and Hampshire, Isle of Wight, they'll often play that connecting part, and it's through the active partnership. I think that's really critical. That word is really important. It isn't necessarily the active partnership is the gatekeeper in those areas. It's actually they work with partners around the table today to bring them in, bring the expertise in. But because they're embedded in that community and local, they also work with public health, they'll work with transport, they'll work with others. So we look at the whole picture, and then they'll try to bring people together to then create the solutions and allow people to... There's often blind spots. If you're in a school, there's blind... I don't know that's there, or same in community. How do we take away those blind spots and create the conditions ultimately for the joined up aspect, which means we're really efficient with our way of working. It's a newer way, I think, in the last 3 years, and we continue as a whole sector with underlined with Uniting the Movement, the strategy of Sport England, which I think has enabled that to drive that forward. So I think the sector is ready to do that. It now just needs really that long-term commitment to go, actually, we're going to really understand this way and this approach, and then we will see the differences long-term. Because if we don't invest in sport and physical activity, that is going to cost this country a huge amount of money down the line. And I know that is difficult.
And can we also just talk about some of the things that are changing in schools? We already talked about the opening up school facilities fund, not the first of its kind, it has to be said. Over the years, there have been many, many attempts to get more schools to open up. But two other things. One is the wraparound programme, which obviously has been a great extension across the school estate. And then the other one is school breakfast, where there's already been the National School Breakfast Programme, but there's about to be a further expansion. And I just wonder to what extent you see those two things as an opportunity or possibly even a drawback. So on wraparound, so we were talking earlier about opening up facilities, and I can't remember which of you said, well, the school's open anyway. And sometimes that's actually the problem. So it's not a help, because sometimes the issues are about safeguarding questions and, well, if I've got children on site here, how do I have adults on site here, and it's the same set of facilities or corridors or whatever it might be. But there are also clearly opportunities, because you've got kids in school for longer, more after school clubs and all the rest of it. And then on breakfast clubs, which is so that's going to extend to a lot more schools, but it's a club as well as a breakfast. Are local sports clubs geared up to take sort of maximum advantage of that, and what could government do to make sure that we get a double whammy from that, not just on food, but on making sure kids are doing more sport and physical activity?
Yeah, I don't mind going quickly first. I think sport has a contribution to play. It isn't necessarily the only thing in town, like you've just alluded to. I think there's a maturity in our sector now that sometimes we play a part of a broader picture that a school is trying to achieve and a community is trying to achieve. So we certainly find that approach is helping to enable success and opening up, as you say, and actually how do we align a breakfast sports club with the breakfast club. HAF is a great example, and you've got StreetGames here later today who will be able to talk about that, how we're aligning HAF to be part of the contribution to actually fulfilling a children and young people's life. So That's why...
Holiday Activities and Food Fund, we should probably just spell out.
Yes, sorry, I've used my first acronym of the day. It's taken me a while. But yeah, no, we contribute. The health system, we contribute. We play a part. So I think we recognise they can't have things standing alone. If we sell it to the schools, and that does happen, is actually the efficiencies of we're all open anyway. We can work alongside each other and have that coherence amongst a school, but with that vision and that common goal. I think we do have to move from thinking sport and physical activity solves it on its own. We're part of that broader, bigger picture, and hopefully the mission-led part can help that, but we certainly need the overarching vision.
Can I just come in terms of, you talked about solutions. I think for me what's really simple, teachers are in schools to teach, volunteers are volunteering, the gap is in the middle. I'm trying to be simplistic. The gap is in the middle. What we need is school community connectors, motivators, whatever we want to call them. That is the infrastructure. We need a national dedicated infrastructure to ensure that volunteers, this teacher knows that this club over here, the rugby club, is available and these are the hours. This club says, actually, we can bring in a coach who is qualified and safe and provide the right experience for that young person at breakfast time. Mm-hmm. We haven't got that conduit. It kind of sits in that gap in the middle. And I think for me, one of the big solutions to this big gap is around those connectors. So that would be a recommendation I would suggest we take forward.
May I ask just one more question? Come back to something we were talking about earlier, on which I think was a really interesting point, but I think we need to try and tease it out into like a proposal, or at least an outline proposal. This thing about, if you've got an Astro, 3G Astro, that's great, and some football clubs can easily afford to pay 50 quid an hour, but a small community group just can't. So I guess the question is, what do you do about that? So I visited a 3G Astro the other day, newly installed with the help of the Football Foundation, absolutely fantastic at Horndean Tech in my constituency. So the capital was okay, but then, of course, they need a sinking fund. And to get a sinking fund, what you need to do, you need to charge people to use it. And if you weren't able to charge people to use it, frankly, you just wouldn't be able to build it. But the point you make is still a really important one. How do you make sure that everybody is benefiting? So I guess the question is just, well, how do you bridge that gap? Do you, have price controls? Or do you say, I'm sorry, I'm not advocating these are open questions. Or do you say councils should be subsidising, or there should be some other way of enabling all sports, all activities, and therefore more people to take part?
I think there's an element of private sector learning, understanding the supply and demand, which will vary enormously by region, because in some areas there won't be a requirement, and it's great for the school or the leisure facility for it to go to the highest bidder. And I think there's kind of a mapping exercise to do to look at where there is limited or no provision in the form, provisional facilities for those target audiences, young people in deprived and underserved communities, where you would need to put a more disproportionate focus and emphasis. Easier said than done.
Who is you? I suppose that's the question. Who does it? Who spots the fact that middle-aged men playing football, that's fine. That will always get funded. Kids playing some minority sport won't. It may be that there just isn't an obvious answer. In which case, in our report, we can say there isn't an obvious answer, but this is a problem that's been identified.
I mean, there's some mapping exercises around the obvious things you can do. You're looking at high areas of need, IMD 1 to 3, and doing a mapping exercise to say high areas of deprivation overlaid with what provisions are there in the areas for that. But essentially, where there is a need for intervention, to create a number of sessions every week for community groups, it needs to be, I guess, the only way of incentivising schools and leisure facilities to do that is to have some form of subsidy, which I guess the obvious recommendation there would be for that to sit with local authorities and councils.
And just to add on to that, I think I talk about we as a network of the last few years just moved towards inequalities. Yes, there's a universal for an area in terms of what the Active Partnership does, but actually unapologetically which areas in that area needs to support the most, which is the way we're playing that conduit connecting role, linking in with local authorities, public health, schools, to recognise where those gaps are. How do we bring funding in so it is actually going into those communities that need it the most, those clubs, those schools that need that, and playing that role within it. We have seen through the Together Fund, again, bringing partners on board with us, the place investment, which I think is the future direction of travel of where we will need to go if we want sport and physical activity to be positioned across other areas of government. We need to do that. There are other parts of funding. There's multi-sport facility fund that we are just working with Sport England on at the moment, and that's about mobilising sites, because you'll go across London, you'll go across other areas, and you'll see some sites which aren't used all the time. And then it comes to who then uses it is those that can afford it. So actually, how do we ensure that there is funding associated with capital funding to mobilise for those that can't necessarily afford it? But then you need that local insight to do that. One of the challenges has been local authorities around the table with us all the time, but their sports development departments aren't the size as they were. They aren't able to do that work in connecting it. But how do we maximise their facility stock and other parts of that around the right table?
Very good, thank you very much. And finally, James.
Thank you. Good morning. Thank you for coming in. Moving on to sports strategy, understanding what a new strategy might contain. The new government hasn't yet confirmed whether it intends to carry on with the Get Active sports strategy brought in by the last government. In assessing that, what do you think was effective in the strategy, and what changes would you make to it? That's to all of you, so whoever wants to go first.
I mean, I'm happy to kick off. I think what was there was what's absolutely essential when we're talking about social impact and social value is taking a cross-departmental approach, and health, justice, education absolutely being joined up, but having a strategy and vision for the long term. I think, as you know, and I will always unashamedly champion the small volunteer-led groups that we represent. I think it's really important through the strategy that there is a recognition for the difference-making role that volunteer groups make. It's using sport as a mechanism and the social value create, that they are so much more than purely driving participation, physical well-being and elite sport. They're important, but we need to think beyond that. So I think I guess sort of the framework and the outline of the strategy was good. I think what was missing was the so what, and what does the delivery of that strategy look like, particularly when it comes to tackling inequalities. And let me give an example of that. Nowhere within the strategy was there any formal or strong recognition of these volunteer-led groups, of which there are thousands across the UK. They will play a fundamental role in the delivery, essentially reaching those target audiences. So I think at a high level, the framework of the strategy was great, but how does this translate into reality? What mechanisms and what networks and what partners are going to come together to ensure the effective delivery of this? So it is simply not purely around numbers, activity levels and participation, which will benefit elite sport and broader health and well-being, but won't fundamentally address some of society's biggest issues, which is about tackling inequality. So essentially more about the mechanisms and the delivery of.
Was your assessment of that strategy that there was enough cross-departmental emphasis, and did you have interaction or sight of the ones you've listed?
Yeah, I think that the sentiment was there. I'm not sure really in terms of the implementation of that strategy. The strategy didn't really get going. So I guess it's a case of, the sentiment was strong. There were big questions and a level of cynicism, I think, around the practicalities of this working in practice. So I guess it's, the premise of the strategy was good. It talked about 75% of investment committed to the areas of lowest activity with a really strong focus on social outcomes. But there's a big difference between having a vision and how that translates into reality, and it's about the delivery mechanisms for bringing that to life.
Thank you. Yes, sir.
I think just in terms of the strategy, with good intent, but I think the key thing for the sector through the National Sector Partner Group, which is the representative bodies across the sector, was around a stronger ambition for our society, and we did some comparative analysis of inactivity across Europe, and we are ranked 11th out of 15 comparative nations in terms of inactivity. So on a medal table, we're not up top. And we believe that the ambition should be that we want to be the most active nation in Europe. And we can do that. And if we do that, we'll make significant savings. Forgive me for reading, but I want to get it right. We would make a saving, this is annually, of £1 billion in healthcare savings, 3.5 billion in GDP, and 70 billion in wellbeing benefits, if we align ourselves to people like Finland and Denmark, who are at top of the league table. And we can do that. We're doing some more detailed analysis in relation to strategy. What are the key policy levers that enable them to do that? Because Finland wasn't the top 15 years ago. So what have they done policy-wise to get them there? And we're more than willing to share that with you. So I think in terms of strategy, yes, strategy exists. It was looking down. We as national partners try desperately to work across government. It has been challenging. Government is busy. And I think that's where the new strategy, if one is to be developed, is to ensure that sport and recreation is at the heart of the Prime Minister and Treasury's business, because we can drive growth, we can drive the economy, we can save the NHS. And it is critical for us to be healthy, happy and prosperous as a nation. So it's the upward moment that I would look to in terms of any new strategy.
That fine list of outcomes, do you know the cost to drive those outcomes? Is it a net growth outcome as a result?
We're
or does
looking
it cost as much to achieve?
No. So in terms of our current investment as UK government, it's 0.4%. If we were looking to increase, so currently Finland is 1%. Sorry, wrong way around. Yes, 0.4% and Finland is 1%. So we would need to increase it, but the savings far outweigh that increase.
And clearly speak to the cross-departmental point that Sarah's making. Andy?
Yeah, thank you. I suppose the existing strategy, again, we were consulted on it, we were engaged in it. I sat in the task force, and I felt the task force was getting the right people around the table, which was a positive in terms of it was cross-government engagement. I think the challenges moving forwards with a new strategy is devolution is taking place. Where is the accountability in the system? I think is absolutely critical. And I've talked a lot today about place-based working and investing into communities. Well, actually, what is the framework and overarching piece which government holds? Where's the accountability within that? And actually, where is devolved into local decision-making and investment into local? The other bit as well is about I've mentioned it a couple of times as well, where does the inactivity sit? So one of the challenges with the strategy is, and all of these areas are really important, it's not one or the other, sport, high performance, inequalities within sport and grassroots, but also it was trying to answer inactivity, which is one of the areas that Department for Health has on their key priorities as well, with linked prevention. So really trying to bottom out where that sits, if it has to sit anywhere. For me, inactivity should be across every strategy, across whole of government, because we all have a responsibility, from education through to transport, through to housing. We need to tackle inactivity, but it isn't just DCMS's responsibility, and it isn't just the sports sector's responsibility. So it ends up trying to potentially achieve support everyone around that.
And just on the government strategy around harder to reach communities and the inequality argument, what interventions have proven most successful in this strategy, or in your view before this one?
I will touch on Uniting the Movement. I think this strategy did follow the intentions of Uniting the Movement, which was tackling inequalities. It was too early to probably judge successes around certain parts of that. But even the outcomes on that were going towards local outcomes aligned with active lives. So then you've got to devolve it into local. And the place-based investment, we know is the right approach to that. It's very early days at the moment. But that is the opportunity. We see it locally. We go into place-based working. Other departments locally want to come around the table, from Director of Public Health, Transport. Can we mirror that nationally? Is really the key, because I think that is the approach to then move that forwards. And the example is the North Bradford example, where you've got a whole system working together for a common goal. We are seeing local physical activity strategies being developed and commissioned and led. That then brings around all the partners, because really we create the framework and the conditions. It's locally where the work really happens. And the nuances from a rural or coastal area to an urban area is so different. we need to create the conditions to enable that decision making to be very, very different as well, and to be comfortable with that.
Well, the legacy of things like parkrun, is that, can we learn from that as it to sort of let things spring out of nothing, or seemingly out of nothing? I mean, from a distance, obviously, a lot of hard work will have gone into it, but what can we learn from those more community-based or entrepreneur-based activities that have just completely taken over, brilliantly so, and yet you could see a scenario where government, devolved or otherwise, could attempt a similar thing and just crush it by accident?
My message would be, don't do it top down, because you're absolutely right. There's a huge amount of intervention. There's Just Parks, there's Our Parks, there's Junior Park Run now. You want to create the conditions for that to take place. What we need to then make sure is that, and Parkrun do this now, is actually ensure that that is in communities that probably need it the most as well. Where it probably, when it started out, from what I understand, probably was more into areas who people were already active. So we're starting to see that our role has to be to empower that innovation. High Rocks is a great example, and some of the work that the private leisure facilities and public leisure are doing, local authorities, like lawn tennis, can reel it off. There's some brilliant stuff if we really listen to communities. And that's the critical bit. If we don't listen to communities, we will keep going around the cycle of doing something and doing it again and doing it again. So the more we can empower, the better.
But I think parkrun is also a great example of the challenges that are faced with tackling deep-rooted inequalities. I mean, parkrun has been a phenomenal concept, and the following is phenomenal and has done a great job at increasing participation and addressing the broader health and well-being. To what extent has parkrun been effective in attracting inactive people from ethnically diverse backgrounds from highly deprived areas? And you could say, well, hang on, it's free, anyone can go. But are the transport routes free? Are there cultural barriers that are getting people from certain communities involved? There are a lot of barriers. There are a lot of psychological barriers, but also cost barriers that are enabling what is a phenomenal concept to essentially reach communities. And I think, therefore, there's also some great learnings to be taken from that to say, why is that, and what could and should we be doing differently?
Yeah. I'm about to do my first High Rocks competition, so it's nice to get a shout out at High Rocks.
Good luck.
Very impressive. Thank you very much. Thanks, guys. That brings us to the end of this first panel. Before we let you flee, was there any questions that you were hoping that we would ask you, any points that you were hoping to land with us today?
Can I just land one last thing? Is obviously the challenging fiscal environment. I think it's absolutely critical that we do protect existing funding. I think obviously there's uncertainty at the moment. Somehow we've maintained existing activity levels, and that's down to a brilliant sector that works tirelessly to do that. If funding reduces, those activity levels will reduce, and that will cost this country money. So how we protect them and then build on, I think, is absolutely critical. And I think it's important to say that with obviously decision making in the coming months.
Very good.
I would just, building on the point around private sector investment, is how do we do more to leverage that, and to seriously think about the benefits and value in some form of incentives to the private sector. No matter how tough the economic climate gets, they will stay committed to CSR and ESG, and we need to ensure that sport for development and community sport is front of mind when they're building their strategies.
Thank you.
Just as finally, just to reiterate, protect core investments through DCMS and our arm's length bodies, and really continue to invest in PE and school sport. That is critical for our young people and the future.
Fantastic. Thanks all of you for joining us this morning. We're now going to suspend the session very briefly to allow our next panel Order. Welcome to our second panel, which is focused on the challenges facing clubs and what can be done to engage underrepresented groups such as those from deprived communities, women and girls and disabled people. And we're joined by Stephanie Hilborne OBE, who is the Chief Executive of Women in Sport. We're joined by Emily Robinson, who is the Chief Executive of London Sport. We're joined by Anna Scott Marshall, who is the Director of Communications and Social Impact at the British Paralympic Association. And we're joined by Mark Lawrie, who is the Chief Executive of StreetGames. You're all really welcome. Thank you so much for joining us today. I'm going to pass to Liz for the first question, please.
Thank you, Chair, and good morning to all of you. I recently had the pleasure of attending a local football match at one of my local primary schools in my constituency of Eastleigh, where the girls were all aspiring to be the next generation of lionesses, and it was really wonderful to see them playing. But according to data from Sport England's Active Lives Children and Young People report, girls are less active than boys in every school year. So if I could ask Stephanie, why are girls still missing out on the benefits of school sports, and what tangible things can the government do to address this inequality?
Yes, well, it is a big question. I think the context of this as well is why it matters. If you think of the gendered health inequalities that we face, with 1 in 2 women suffering from osteoporosis, breaking a bone, compared to 1 in 9 men, with the mental health crisis, particularly in the late teenage, early young women, now being so extreme, and in fact the inequalities in suffering of autoimmune conditions, which are related to stress and also ameliorative activity, it matters so much, and that's without even thinking about the educational cognitive development that comes along with exercise. Why is it still happening? Our research shows that societal stereotyping is still alive and well. We're telling our little girls from almost the moment they can move to be careful. We're telling them that other people's needs matter more than their own, to be kind. We're instilling on boys, we've done research on boys as well, with the sense that their status entirely depends on proof that they're the best at football, that sport is so fundamental to who they are, they must push anyone out of the way, boy or girl, that will stop that happening. And they're entering school with a skills gap, the girls, and that isn't recognised in the same way that the boys are entering school with fine motor skills gap, and that is recognised, so they're being skilled up in writing. We need to be training our teachers to understand that the girls are entering with a sports skills deficit, and they need trained up and skilled up in sport. Because as it happens, as you mentioned, it's absolutely, every time I see a little girl trying to be a lioness, it warms the heart, doesn't it? But there's still a 24% gap between participation in team sports between girls and boys. That is very stubborn. It's been there for a long time, even with this incredible change, which is basically putting women's team sport on the telly at all, which literally it wasn't when I was young. That's not shifting enough. So one major intervention has to be the training of teachers, and that's all teachers at primary level, because they're all involved in the children's activity, but particularly specialist PE provision, which, as we know, has been dropping. Schools have been bringing in external agencies who tend to be young blokes who love sport coming in to interact with the children. They're not professional educationalists who understand the needs of the children. So it's training the teachers in the gender stereotyping, also in the physiological differences between girls and boys, which are there before puberty, but obviously much more extreme after, and in female puberty, and how to support girls to manage periods, to use sports bras. Only 13% of schools have sports bras on the kit list. And that really massively matters, because we see 1.3 million girls dropping out of sport after primary age. And the other thing to remember about school sport for girls is that for 37% of girls, it's the only time they ever do any sport, which just makes the importance of it so much more important. So that the teacher training is one big thing. The provision of facilities is the other. We know that there's no single-sex toilets in about 28% of schools now. How are you going to manage your period if you've got to wash your hands after changing your tampon, just to be blunt, in front of the boys? You're not going to do that. You can't do that, and you can't do sport if you can't manage your periods. So, this whole facility factor is big, and just letting the girls go to school already dressed for sport on days they're going to play it, that has been proven to be massively effective. So there are some really quite simple things where we just lift bureaucracy and it makes it work. And then it's actually also single-sex opportunities for the girls. Not only because I think, we think and we know that some well-managed mixed sex can be good. But if PE isn't more central to the school, if we're not recognising the value of it to cognitive development, to educational attainment, then the girls actually who most love sport, in fact our research shows that black girls dream the most of sport, 60% of black girls dream of reaching the top compared to 33 or 4% of white British girls, but they're the least active, they're under the most pressure for educational attainment. There's not the understanding that the sport will help with that. And the teachers and parents need to be pushing that messaging out, and the government could be pushing that messaging out. The sport helps educational attainment. That would really, really help. So I've covered quite a lot of ground there, but the 91% of girls, Christchurch University in Canterbury says, primary school kids, 91% of them understand that activity helps them learn. But it seems that as adults we've kind of lost our way with that.
Thank you. And if I could ask Anna, you recently launched the Equal Play campaign, which is calling on the government to address the barriers that prevent disabled children from participating in physical education and sports in school. What changes need to happen to ensure more disabled children are active and enjoying sports at school?
Thank you. As ParalympicsGB, we work with elite athletes who came second in the medal table in Paris. But shockingly, only about 75% of disabled children say they don't take part regularly in sport or PE or physical activity in school. So there's clearly an imbalance there. And actually, many Paralympic athletes said they didn't take part in school, but it was a good coach, a parent, or somebody who spotted them, and then they then became the elite athletes they are now. So we're talking about 1.5 million children in the school population, about 15%. We run a schools programme with our Olympic counterparts, Team GB, and so we know where it can work really well. It helps to have really focused campaigns that all schools can take part in, as well as connecting with community groups, with active partnerships with StreetGames and others as part of this programme to really support schools in delivering really good motivated PE and school sport. But really, fundamentally, the biggest issue is actually a lack of confidence and a lack of understanding from teachers and schools in terms of how to deliver inclusive PE and sport. And that's not through lack of wanting to, or, the teachers really sort of not believing in it. So it's really about empowering teachers to have more confidence to deliver good PE and physical education, and for those groups who come in to provide sport also to ensure that they do. So that's probably around tools for existing teachers, so that's CPD, and there's a real range of stuff out there, but there's no, it would be helpful for the government to just be really clear about a good CPD programme for existing teachers, and for a bit of leadership from schools themselves that this is important and that it's something they believe in. I think also it's just the lens within which disabled children and their counterparts see the rest of their lives. If it's okay for kids to be sat on the sidelines, sat in the classroom while everyone else is taking part in sport, it actually sends a signal that that's what they can expect in the rest of their lives too. And so that's a pretty sort of fundamental basis of where disabled young people start their lives. The other is there's very, very little to no focus within the initial teacher training. So for new teachers, they don't really have any focus on PE for disabled young people. So a really simple change would be to change that initial teacher training and to embed that within the teacher training. There's a curriculum review at the moment, and having a better emphasis on curriculum and the importance of sport and PE, and for that being inclusive for all, would be really important. And I think the interim review sort of hasn't really mentioned much about sport and PE so far, so it'd be really good to see that the curriculum review addresses that. And I guess that's part of the danger currently. It's not a core PE is not core curriculum subject, and so the curriculum review is also focusing on outcomes and attainment, which obviously sport falls outside of, and of course that's what often happens in the school day. And then finally, we talked a bit about role models in this session from a range of areas, but there are very, very few disabled teachers within the workforce, about 0.5%. Clearly, apart from anything else, that's missing a huge amount of skilled people who could be within the workforce. So improving the recruitment of disabled teachers who are part of the workforce, understand disabled young people's needs, but also just sort of change the culture. And we experience that even in our own organisation. You know, the more people you work with, the better you understand what people need.
Thank you.
Thanks, Liz. Damien.
Thank you. Can I come back to girls? Stephanie, you mentioned the skills gap, even at kind of year R. So what do you do about that?
Well, it's a bit like comparing it to the sort of the writing skills. You need to be deliberately skilling those girls up.
But in writing skills, we've kind of figured out that in the EYFS, the early years foundation stage, you need to have a real focus on writing and the holding the pencil. Let's have more about holding the pencil and so on. But is that the issue when we talk about the skills gap, or is it more about stuff at home, cultural things? What's the combination?
Well, the home stuff is obviously massive, and the cultural stuff at home, and with a bit of call out to dads, because the data shows that dads are critical in supporting their girls with the skills stuff, but proportionately they support their girls less than the boys. But I mean, the school thing is on entry. If there's a recognition, those girls will have gaps in kicking, throwing, you know, catching a ball, for example, in other aspects that the boys will be skilled up in. It's not being afraid to specifically work with those girls in the right way to skill them up. So it's a sort of deliberate intervention issue, and taking that seriously, rather than just sending them out into the playground to get excluded by the boys because, you know, the boys are going to be better, tougher, and think their whole lives depend on it. So, you know, that is going to lead to what the YST have shown is a sort of halving of self-belief in girls by the time they leave primary school. Girls are not born underconfident. Mm-hmm. You know, it's the effect of this that saps their self-belief. And so it's an intervention, and school is a place where that can happen if we understand that and if we're prepared to accept that. So you've got a mixed class inevitably in a normal primary school, but it's understanding you might need to take the girls aside, skill them up a bit more, you know, while the boys might be doing something else, and then maybe mix them up a bit more. But it's just recognising it and seeing that it matters, because nobody thinks it matters.
That would be the opposite of what a lot of people would think. It's just worth perhaps dwelling on. So do you want to say a little bit more about why it might be important to separate boys and girls for some of the time?
I think it's really complicated, but, you know, we know we've got this societal context of really horrendous changes in attitudes toward women. The week's latest poll showed that between 2019 and 2025, the number of young men in this country aged 15 to 24 who think that women are equally capable of leadership roles has dropped from 82% to 51%. That's how drastic it is. So how do you address that through sport? Because sport is a massive opportunity to either further that or address it. How you do that in mixed contexts in primary schools is going to be quite sophisticated, and there will be times when you have to separate the sexes and times when you have to have them working together, and we've got guidance on this out to teachers, coaches and parents in how you might do this, which would be rewarding sport for what its actual value is. So rewarding and emphasising the value of good teamwork, the value of leadership, the values that actually sport is instilling, and not always talking about the outcome and the win or the not win. Giving the boy who's shown the best attitude to the girls the captain position, you know, not the boy who's been crushing them. It's subtle interventions like that that begin to build up respect between the sexes. Yeah. But if you throw them in with this massive skills gap at the start, it's going to be harder to do that. So you need to, at the same time, be working on that.
And let me open this. Yes, I was going to say.
Add a sort of another practical example. What we found through the Opening Schools Facilities programme that we've been running in London is that by introducing new sports where you might not have that predetermined gap, that can be really successful. So we've helped leverage in the NFL Foundation on flag football, which doesn't really exist in this country in quite the same way, and where girls and boys can play a sport where they're at the entry level together. That can be more productive if they're playing in a mixed setting, or other sports maybe like cricket where they can play together for longer. One of, I guess, the issues is football is so dominant in our culture that as a boy you learn to kick as soon as you learn to walk, and we find that gap exists with girls who it's improved because my generation didn't get to play football at all, but there's still that big significant gap. And then the other thing in terms of coaching and seeing those role models from the sidelines, only 30% of coaches in London are women. So that's a really big gap, and bringing in those specialists who understand how to encourage children and develop their love of the sport through seeing women themselves on the sidelines in the kit playing is also really important.
Actually, you've sort of teed me up for two other questions I was going to ask. The first, I think it's a very interesting question about all these extra sports that are available now that didn't used to be. Dodgeball is a big thing for kids at the moment, but also lots of girls playing cricket, girls playing football and so on. I guess one of the big questions is to what extent does that then deliver a net increase in the amount of sport, and to what extent does it displace something else? And I asked that not as a leading question or rhetorical one. I honestly don't know, and I don't know if anyone's actually done any kind of comprehensive work on it, but if you do, it would be quite helpful for this inquiry.
I mean, overall,
there is some data. There is some data on it, isn't there, Emily?
Yeah, there is. I mean, the overall activity levels have not significantly improved over the last 10 years. So it's difficult to say that these new sports, I think, have led to a bigger increase across the board.
Yeah, I mean, I think the issue in terms of girls' engagement is that the girls who are probably jumping into the football gap that we weren't allowed in were probably playing netball, hockey, etc. So you're right. You know, it's a question about, are we really reaching completely new people?
Yeah.
There is something about the accessible nature of some of these sports as well, though. So when you think about something like dodgeball, I was up in Salford the other week at a youth club watching young people with no money, no equipment, but they were able to play dodgeball, and they didn't need shin pads and they didn't need all the things that you might do to access football. So some of the sports that you're describing there are actually easier for some of those young people who might suffer, particularly socioeconomic inequalities, to access. Whether it shifts the dial, I don't know about the data, but it's very clear that those kinds of sports remove barriers in a different way, perhaps.
Yeah, I think that's it. I don't know if there is conclusive data, but I guess what schools have started to focus on is opening up an understanding of what sport and PE might include, which is much broader than sort of just your football and rugby, and therefore that does allow a much greater diversity of people to consider taking part in sport and PE, or to be more enthusiastic about it in the school setting, but also into the community. And I guess one of the things that we see in our schools programme as well is, are there sports or activities that children can take part with their families, obviously particularly through our eyes of disabled children, but in general, and that being one of the key drivers that families were saying and children were saying was stopping them taking part in things previously. So opening up a greater breadth of sports, including with grandparents, and sort of a whole range from bocce to other sports that you might not need a huge amount of equipment, or you can be physically active, has definitely opened up things.
My last question, Chair, if I may, I want to go back to the question about drop-off in girls' participation in sport. So notwithstanding whatever the gap may be at age 5, we know that in the teenage years there is quite a substantial fall-off, and Stephanie, you mentioned concerns around mental health and so on. I think these things are becoming more prominent possibly than ever. So from the perspective of trying to make kind of actual recommendations to government or to the public sector or to large organisations, what more can we do? And you mentioned a couple already about girls turning up to school already dressed for sport, for example, but what practical things could be done to try and reduce that off? Sorry, by the way, I should be clear, whether we're talking about school or more generally in terms of community participation.
Sorry, the silent about girls means I'm probably talking the most, if everyone's all right. I think
we'll be giving everyone plenty of opportunity to level the playing field.
I'll shut up shortly. I mean, I mentioned the early years thing because actually the teenage drop-off everyone's aware of. It's not just sudden. It's because you've already not got the self-belief. But I think then the two issues that then hit are the sexualisation of the stereotyping experience, the horrors of social media, the horrendous pressure now on girls to look exactly just right, which has a massive impact on sport, or willingness to participate, or time to recover from, etc. What can we? But also the physiological impact of female puberty, which it only was put on the curriculum, really, puberty, about a couple of years ago. I mean, it is just not taught. I mean, our generation learnt about it in rabbits and never really understood it because, they reabsorb. So, there's very bad education about it, and there's very poor support for it. So if we are now, as a society, normalising conversations about female reproductive issues far more than we ever did, but that isn't really in the system yet. So there does need to be more focus on that. In the community, one initiative that we have worked on with Places Leisure and with some DCMS support is the Big Sister programme, which is looking particularly at teenage girls, particularly from deprived communities. What happens if some leisure centres give them free access to the leisure centre, put on female-only opportunities with promised female leaders of those group opportunities or swims or whatever it is. What happens when you do that? What happens when you train all the leisure centre staff to understand the needs of teenage girls, and in the first case, which was a funded programme, also provide free period products? And most importantly, what happens when leisure centre staff go out into communities to school to tell the girls it's there and that they could come and use it? Well, it's really quite hugely impactful. That was a very, very impactful programme, which Places Leisure have now rolled out to all its 100 or so leisure centres. But without government funding, it means it's not quite so easy to put on, and they've had to make it reduced price, not free, for universal credit, etc. But it just demonstrates that if the girls feel they're invited in, they know it's there, they're safe, it's single sex at times, then they will come. So we just need to treat it with the seriousness it deserves, I think, to some extent. And then just be really respectful about the practical physiological needs of a female going through puberty and the need for clean, safe toilet facilities, etc.
We just speed up our sorry to be the nagging old woman in the corner, but can we speed up our answers a little bit, please, chaps?
I had just one more practical recommendation in terms of beyond school sport. We do have public sector equality duties on local authorities, and we often see that they're not applied in informal spaces or playgrounds or those sorts of areas outside of houses and buildings where we could be doing a lot more to encourage women and girls to exercise outside. So they're thinking about parks and the provision. So if you're just building a skate park or a football pitch, you're much more likely to have boys and men using that rather than girls. And the other thing would be then thinking about female coaches. How do we use existing skills and training money, government money, to look at workforce within the sports stuff?
Really quickly.
Are there any particular sports the provision of which has shown to reduce the drop-off?
Pretty well all
in
affected.
Schools?
I think the quietness from us would probably say that it's not obvious which
no, it's
one.
because it's in the girls' relationship with the whole of sport which is affecting it.
Okay, thank you.
Stephanie, you mentioned a really powerful statistic which I didn't manage to write down, so I'm going to invite you to say it again, but about the perception that boys of a certain age have of the capabilities of girls and women to lead. Has there been any research into, is that a COVID thing? Is it the explosion of smartphone and social media? Is it all of the above? What's your insight, or what is the perceived wisdom on that?
Perceived wisdom probably more than our direct insight. I mean, it's the backdrop of the Andrew Tate, the misogyny, the growing, rising misogyny, the conflict, the division of the sexes over politics, the whole sort of conflict zone out there that is affecting young boys, isn't it? Which is now the focus of so much work and brilliant programmes on TV. You know, it's terrifying. In Germany, the number of young men who think women's place should be in the home has risen from 5% to 22% since 2021. So it's very rapid. It's only in the last sort of almost 5 years that these attitudes have been growing in Europe. So that's the sort of terrifying backdrop. And I raise it just because it's that serious, that, you know, sport can play a really major role in building respect.
You see a scenario, though, where not only, to your point about the girls arriving needing to be skilled up and separated, I agree with Damien's points that'll be counterintuitive to some experiences, possibly even upset parents and the children themselves that, we were divided up straight away into girls and boys. Notwithstanding, I get the point. The output is the focus here. But there's a scenario where really you have to be quite explicit in addressing those attitudes with the young boys. It's a boys' problem, not a girls' problem. From
Absolutely. I mean, and when I say separated, I don't mean all the time. It's impractical all the time. It's just at times. But absolutely, the focus on the research we did last year was under 11 boys, and we put some guidance out on our site, which is about how do you encourage those boys through sport to show more respect and to understand the real value of sport. Because if they think it's the ultimate end point, then of course men are stronger, faster, bigger even before puberty. So obviously they're better. But if they see the value of sport as a more complex thing about, joint endeavour and about these other issues which its real value lies in, then that will shift their emphasis. So I think we can work with boys on that.
Thank you. Thank you very much, Jo.
Thank you, Chair. So I want to concentrate on the links between schools and community sport. And so if we take the disparities for children and young people from low economic backgrounds that are taking part in sports, and that's reducing, but similar schools who are in more of our challenging or disadvantaged areas, with pupils less pupils likely to offer a range of clubs and societies. So with this lack of communication between school and community sports, what framework could the government put in place now to help promote and facilitate these connections? And that goes to you, Mark, so I'm looking at you.
Thank you. So, for context, I suppose StreetGames works with local community organisations in the most deprived areas. I think one of the crucial things that needs to happen, and it was touched on in the previous panel, is there needs to be a recognition of the vital role that community sport organisations play. And by community sport organisations, I don't necessarily mean just sports clubs. It can be about youth clubs, it can be about those community groups that exist in the heart of our most deprived neighbourhoods, and they need to be recognised, first of all, in policy terms. They then need to be invested in, and that's not just in terms of finance, but in terms of development of workforce, and that capacity at a local level needs to play a very specific place-based role in making sure that those community organisations that can make genuine connections with schools and young people are supported to be in the right places. And so the third thing, as well as the recognition and the investment for me, is about involving them in local decision making. Because very often we talk about schools and communities, and often, if you're honest, having been a primary school teacher, the power sits with the school. The school is the larger body in an area, and you've got a kind of David and Goliath thing going on sometimes in local communities. And so the capacity that needs to go in at a local level needs to draw on the strengths of both and actually enable community organisations who, bearing in mind that children and young people spend 86% of their lives outside of school classrooms, have a huge role to play. And particularly when you talk about areas of deprivation, the 13 weeks of the school holidays for those children and young people who aren't in school, that's potentially an activity desert. And the holiday activities and food programme that was mentioned earlier, that's helped to bridge some of that. And where that's well implemented in local areas, we're involved in running it in Birmingham, for example, schools and community groups work really effectively together around the holidays. It almost feels ironic to me that we found a space, because nobody really owns the holidays, where you can bring schools and communities together and where you can then start to also connect in with other policy agendas. So in that kind of work, you can connect into criminal justice and some of the concerns about children and young people either being victims or perpetrators of crime in holidays. You can connect into the wider mental health and well-being agenda and start to think about how early help services all connect in. So I don't know what the shape of it is, to answer your question, but I do know that that's what it needs to do in terms of melding those things together.
Okay, and that same question to Emily.
Yeah, well, I think we already have a model through active partnerships. So London Sport is an active partnership, and Andy from the Active Partnerships Network, there's 42 equivalents of us around the country, and part of our role is to make those connections between schools, community clubs, local authorities, and national governing bodies. The Opening Schools Facilities Programme, which we're devastated about that is stopping, was working incredibly well for us to make those connections, because just a small amount of capacity funding can unlock those things. So the average grant that was given out by us to a school in London was £11,000. That's really not that much. And actually, when I've spoken to people in the private sector, they're surprised that a school would actually open their facilities for such a small amount of money. But it is only a small amount that is required to help build that capacity for lettings or bringing coaches in or making those relationships. The other thing is the role of the active partnership in making sense of all of these fragmented funding streams that was touched upon in the earlier session. So we allocate funding from Sport England through Places. We help work with the Football Foundation on play zones about building those community consortium. We've been running the Opening Schools Facilities programme. On top of that, you get funding for school games, School Sport Premium, and then other initiatives that will come from national governing bodies, often linked to major events or other kind of initiatives that are going on, against a backdrop of increasing lack of resource from local authorities who've traditionally played that role, where now there are councils, for example, Brent, there is nobody at all in the council who has sport in their role or their title. So we work with the public health team or the planning team. And all the parts of the system that we work with, probably for all of us, has seen massive disinvestment. So parks, leisure centres, youth services, community centres. Increasingly, we're looking at non-traditional spaces because of a lack of facilities, car parks, empty shops, libraries, and actually just last week we launched a campaign called More Ball Games against the no ball game signs. So thinking about specific things that you can do that don't cost the earth, but in London we estimate there are 7,000 signs that say no ball games on estates. So how can we encourage children and young people to be physically active when they are literally being told not to play? So we're trying to take those signs down, and local authorities are working with us on it. But that's, I guess, what we're working within, and then those inequalities are quite stark. So we know, for example, that less than half of black secondary school children in London can swim, compared to 80% of their white counterparts, and you're 3 times less likely to be active if you come from a deprived area. We're all working in different ways on how we tackle those inequalities, and there will be some quite bespoke solutions, but also we need facilities and we need funding to keep community groups and clubs going.
Your belief is this sort of central person, if you like, that's connected, that's in the place and connecting all these your schools to your clubs, to your place.
Yeah, so that's the role that we're already playing as an active partnership. I guess what's challenging for that is that's against a backdrop of limited local authority capacity and trying to navigate how do we get the best out of these different funding streams, because each funder brings their own conditions. So the more flexible the funding, the better, because you can adapt it locally, which is why Opening Schools Facilities has actually been really quite successful. We've had 3 full-time members of staff servicing 200 schools, so it's a very efficient model, and we don't want more funding for those 200 schools. They're done, but we've got another 2,000 schools in London that are not open after hours, which we could now move on with those 3 members of staff, who of course will be made redundant because the programme ends in 6 days' time.
Mark, is that a model that you'd recognise that would work in, obviously you're going throughout the country and into some of the deprived areas? Is that something that you would...
Certainly, we've been involved as one of the 4 partners in the Opening School Facilities. A large part of what's been really successful in London as well has been really listening to young people's voice within that and hearing what it is they want provided after school, because one of the things we spoke to over 1,000 young people through Opening School Facilities, they don't necessarily want the traditional sporting offer. They don't necessarily want skills and drills. It comes back a little bit to the girls' offer. They want something more informal. They want something they can enjoy with their friends rather than in a competitive group. So that very much connects if the schools are opened and the offer is right, which can often be about who comes in to do the leading of the sessions, then absolutely.
Thank you. Thank you, Joe. Tom.
Thank you. I'm going to ask a little bit about facilities. We've received evidence on the challenges facing facilities, the availability, accessibility, quality, loss of fields and rising costs through third-party hire. The LGA's found that almost 2/3 of UK leisure stock is ageing and past its replacement date, and facilities that have closed for urgent repairs have haven't always reopened. Similarly, Swim England is predicting that there'll be a 40% fall in the number of pools available between 2019 and 2030. What changes from government do you think are needed to address this? Perhaps Emily and then Mark.
I guess the first thing is to have a really clear strategy for facilities locally and nationally. Local authorities often have play and pitch strategies or built facility strategies, but they're not a statutory requirement. Ultimately, we need more capital funding. It really does come down to, there's very little you can do with an ageing stock unless you renew those facilities. We can probably be more innovative about how we do those and thinking about climate change as well. So there are some interesting examples from across the world where people have used data servers to heat swimming pools and gyms that can be connected to the electricity power supply. So while you're cycling, you're literally generating electricity. But I guess more than that, they need to make sense to the local area where they're going to be working and becoming more flexible and fit for the future. We have a lot of existing guidance. Some of it is about the implementation of that guidance. And I think we're all a little bit unclear as to what will happen through the planning changes in terms of whether that's going to be helpful or unhelpful. So I've got quite mixed views on it, because on one hand, I'm concerned that if Sport England are no longer a statutory guarantee, we will see more playing fields lost and more green spaces lost, appreciating the need for housing. Because if you're in London and you're a local authority, you can get quite a lot of money for your land if you can turn it into a luxury block of flats. But at the same time, we equally have situations in terms of providers who'd like to build more facilities or put more facilities on, but the planning system is slow and takes a long time. And on the other side of the fence, the regulations and restrictions prevent things from happening quickly. So if you look at the Crystal Palace National Sports Centre, which is both an elite national centre but also very much serves people locally in Lewisham, Southwark and Lambeth who are from these deprived communities, it has been closed for a long time because it's a Grade 2 listed building. And because it's a Grade 2 listed building, it's costing a lot more and taking a lot longer to renovate it. So I don't know if these changes will make a difference to that or not. But we have certainly, as London Sport and as an active partnership, are mapping the facilities across London, layering on the community clubs. So we know there are 7,000 community clubs. We're looking at the leisure stock and thinking about how we can, I guess, advocate for more funding, because ultimately we think these are drivers of growth. So if there is going to be building from the government, and these are very tangible things that the communities enjoy and can benefit from, and we can demonstrate the social value that comes from investing into sport and leisure facilities. I mean, the irony is, of course, that it's local authorities who foot the bill for these facilities, who are seeing their budgets reduced increasingly. It's actually the Department of Health and the Health Service which stand to benefit the most from the improvements in people's health, who do not fund those facilities at the moment.
Fascinating, thank you. And Mark?
Yeah, I mean, I think there's two particular challenges I would draw out here. The first one is that when you look at the national benchmarking data, in terms of areas where we have existing sports facilities and the user profiles of those facilities, the numbers of users that could be considered from disadvantaged backgrounds is going backwards quite significantly. So the best performing leisure centres are only getting 60% of their local population in terms of users. The worst performing are getting 29%. And that is a real challenge. And a lot of that is obviously economic. It's about the fact that costs are going up, therefore prices are going up. But if we really want to tackle inequalities in access to sport and physical activity, then we have to do something to really challenge that. Some of that, where a lot of leisure facilities are now externalised, may be about what's written into leisure contracts, about how challenging are we being about the inclusion of local communities in leisure contracts. The second thing, which is something that Emily touched on for me, is it's not always about leisure facilities. Sometimes it's about non-traditional facilities that just need a small amount of investment to be better spaces for sport and physical activity. Community centres, provision of games areas that are safe and designed both for boys and girls. There are many different ways, I think, to tackle this other than building very large, very expensive new leisure facilities. So thinking quite creatively, I think, becomes almost inevitable given the context that we're working in at the moment.
Thank you. And I think that leads on to sort of the next area of questioning around how grassroots sports can be made more engaging and accessible to underrepresented groups, which we've touched on a little already. But perhaps Mark and Emily, again, you have more of an opportunity to contribute here. More support is needed to drive participation in sport and tackle inequalities. What are the current initiatives targeting less active groups in low-income communities getting wrong? And briefly, what do you see as the solution? Mark, do you want to?
The crucial thing we've found over 18 years of focusing on this is the provision has to be on the doorstep of young people, and it has to remove the barriers that exist to them getting involved. And those barriers, at a simple level, price always comes up, but it's not the only one. It's about place, how close is it to them, because we know that young people are unlikely to travel more than a mile. It's about the style of provision and making sure that it's delivered by leaders, trusted adults. I thought it was really interesting what Gareth Southgate was saying last week about the importance of trusted adults in developing both young people's understanding of who they are through sport, but also developing that connectedness between young people in a physical space. It's about making sure that the right people are around as part of that as well, and that it's delivered at the right time. And for teenagers, that can sometimes be later than straight away after school. For younger children, it might be that 4 till 5 wraparound childcare slot. So it isn't that complicated at the most basic level, but the challenge is to ensure that that provision is there and available for those areas, those communities and those young people that need it most, because there is a deficit of provision. There are not enough sports clubs, there are not enough youth providers in those areas that can provide that activity. And if we design it around the needs and motivations of young people, which is what the locally trusted organisations we work with do, then we can tackle those stubborn inequalities. But we need to recognise that there are 3.5 million young people living in our most deprived areas. There are 4.3 million young people living in poverty at the moment in the UK, and we're not perhaps doing enough to design sport around their needs at this stage.
Thank you. Emily?
Yeah, I don't think it's a case that people are doing things wrong. And in some ways, it's actually staggering that we've been able to keep activity levels about the same, given we've had COVID and given we've had an energy crisis and given cost of living. And it's just shown, I think, how innovative and creative the community sport sector has been. Similarly to Mark, I mean, there are structural barriers for why underrepresented groups are less active in sport. Some of those are about cost, economic opportunity. If you're working 2 or 3 jobs, how in the gig economy, how easy is it for you to be a sports volunteer or to take your child to a certain activity? There's also transport, particularly think about people with disabilities or long-term health conditions. How do you get to those places, particularly if they're not quite close to you? How do you pay for the kit, the membership fees, if those things happen? There are also things that we have seen in sport. I think we should also acknowledge that there have been some pretty damning reports into sport where we've seen institutional racism and sexism and classism. That affects community groups who want to made to feel welcome. So it's welcome when sports recognise they have those challenges and seek about how to find safer spaces for people to be active in. One of the programmes that we run that's been funded by Sport England is a Sport Welfare Officer programme, which is again across all the active partnerships, working with local community clubs to improve the welfare and the safeguarding and the provision. Equally, echoing back to what Sarah says, that does mean it's added burdens onto volunteers. But we have to manage that with making sure that the spaces are welcoming and available for everyone. And then there are individual barriers, such as maybe Steph has highlighted, or in terms of confidence, and where if we have more role models from those particular communities, people will think, that is for me, that is something I can take part in.
And I guess Anna and Steph, participation levels for women and those with disabilities at the local level is still low, as we've been hearing. what initiative, if there was one, could be introduced to see more individuals taking part in sport?
If I could just, I'll add to rather than repeat some of what's been said. I mean, just there's 24% of the population are disabled, and it's about the only demographic we can all enter at some point. And disabled people are almost twice as likely to be inactive as non-disabled people, but about 75% say they want to be more active, so the desire is there, so clearly there are some barriers. And I think one of the things is, so there's probably two things. One is that definitely the activities are likely to be further away, and therefore things like transport could come into play, and inaccessible facilities. But also, I'm not sure there's enough information out there about what is possible to take part in. So that's both inclusive opportunities, so that's things that people can take part in together, as well as specialist activities. So, for example, there's only 2% of the activities on the Open Active data, which is the listings of all the sport activities that are accessible or inclusive. So for us, our Everybody Moves platform, it aims to point people, disabled people, to those opportunities, but actually we're hamstrung by either those opportunities aren't out there, or rather people aren't confident, clear about how their opportunities are inclusive or accessible. And so that links to the second point, which is really probably about coming back to the same point around schools, confidence and workforce training and recruitment, just for people to better understand what disabled people might need. So often that is a really unfriendly receptionist, or rather than the facility itself, it's that whole sort of workforce experience, as well as better then planning. So if people better understand it, then a lot of those things that they already provide would be much better. Obviously also facilities would be another one.
We're doing a very interesting piece on Paralympics as an inspiration to disabled young people with the Activity Alliance, and what that is showing is that there's a huge sort of accentuation of gender stereotyping. So for the disabled girl, it's like that's the last problem you're going to have, how you're going to go dancing with your friends. For the disabled boy, it's like you are going to go as fast as David Weir or else. So the sort of the pressure's accentuated on the boys, but sort of the girls are almost left behind even more. Couple of points. Gender budgeting is really vital throughout this, whenever we're talking about facilities, local authorities, any investment, any of these initiatives. If we're not actually following the money to see if girls and women are benefiting equally, we will continue to make sure they're not. I mean, a huge investment's going in to new football facilities, etc. Unless they're built in the right way, with the right design, with the right understanding, and also the timetabling is constituted correctly, then girls and women continue to lose out. I just want to throw in this point, which was raised earlier, about the high quality natural green space and high quality, as Wainwright said earlier, high quality pure waters where people can swim naturally. If you don't have money but you do have time, if you have something close to you, that is beautiful. You are naturally going to move in that space, and there are various projects around the country showing that. Wildlife Trust projects where just simply having safe adults present in a park, your little kids straight after primary school will go and play in that because you're aware of it. It's not rocket science. We're just as a society kind of constraining ourselves with system and process. And I just want to finally say that we've been looking at 40 years of history of women in sport, and some of the initiatives done in the 80s and 90s were amazing to allow women from really poor backgrounds who had tiny babies or they're pregnant to use leisure facilities by provision of creches, by women-only swimming. And that actually there was a massive campaign by the UK men's movement in 1998 to stop that happening in Nottinghamshire, with threats of legal action that it was sex discrimination. It was also held up by compulsory competitive tendering, meaning the free rooms provided for creches they need to make money from. And it was also impeded by the fact that the women who were volunteering their time in the creches now had to go through a check for criminal records or whatever it was, so they were bottom of the list. So it's not that we don't know how to do this, it is about just getting back to having the confidence to know this is the right thing to do.
Very good, thank you very much. And last but not least, Rupa.
Thanks. Yeah, I think you were all there when I asked this same question to the panel before. Just we know, actually I think it's figures from London Sport themselves that show there's a lack of diversity in the volunteer workforce. So just what changes would you request of government to get a wider range of people involved in coaching and that kind of thing.
Yeah, I think one of the things is that sport is often left out of national skills schemes. So quite often in London we hear about when it comes to providing training or skills or training to diverse groups, it might be in hospitality or stewarding or security. Very rarely hear about sport and the workforce behind it. And actually it can be quite expensive to become a swimming teacher. And actually that's exactly the sort of thing where you could have a bursary. So we understand that previously the GLA had bursary schemes to encourage more swimming teachers, particularly from ethnically diverse groups, because we know that, building on one of the things that Steph has said, in terms of getting women to swim, getting people from ethnic groups to swim more, relies on having teachers and lifeguards from the similar backgrounds to make it women only. It's amazing how many times women only swimming actually has a male lifeguard or doesn't have female teachers. So I think more could be done in terms of if there are national or even regional skills and training schemes to think about the sporting workforce on a broader scale. So both coaches but volunteers beyond just the coaching workforce. So there are other schemes as well looking at referees and officials and all the other sort of infrastructure that goes behind these things, where again the numbers are incredibly low from people from Black and Asian communities, and it is going to be important that we have things that reach out to those communities. And so if things can be cited in other places such as in faith settings, it's much more likely we're going to be able to attract people to go to those sessions to learn how to do it. But cost is always a huge factor as well.
Yeah, no, if you've got nice parents that can drive you around the country, then do you know what I mean? It's socio-economic as well as ethnicity.
It is. Yeah.
There's a gender lens on that as well, because the data from Sport England shows half and half women and men volunteering, but when it comes to more than once a week, that drops down to 37% of the women are women. And that's obviously also related to the historical stereotyping, the actual time that you're spending washing up and doing everything at home, which is still far higher. But I think we have some very inspiring examples of ethnic minority women who have taken up coaching sports they never played to make sure their girl got a chance to play football because there wasn't a coach and they loved their football, both from South Asian community, from black communities, and with rugby, for instance. So there are some incredible driven women who, on top of a full-time job, are doing that to give their girls a chance. And I think that issue that we are building the inspiration amongst those girls. And, on the positive side, fourth year of our Dream Deficit survey showed that the percentage of girls who dream of reaching the top of the sport has finally gone up from nearly always around 30% to 38%. If those girls are saying, we want it, and those mothers are seeing it's not there, they are stepping in. And it's quite inspiring to hear their stories.
Yeah, we've discussed Bend It Like Beckham in the context of film in this committee, but I mean, that's a good 20-something years ago. If those people can now coach their kids.
Yes, it's that point about if you're trying to help inactive communities, if you don't have a sport or you haven't grown up in a sporty background, it's not obvious how you would become a volunteer or where you would go, and it needs to become easier for people who aren't thinking in a sport-specific lens. They're just thinking, I'd love to help my kids be more active, or I'd like to help the community, rather than, I'm a tennis player, I'm going to go and become a tennis coach. So it's helpful when national governing bodies do things on a more of a multi-sport basis, where you're looking at a skill rather than maybe, how do we get the next elite athlete of this generation?
Yeah, our experience is that over 90% of the young people who get involved in volunteering in the local organisations we work with do so because the adult they trust in that organisation has asked them. And actually the diversity of the volunteers that are around our locally trusted organisation is very strong, because the role models, over 50% of the leaders of the locally trusted organisations we work with, are from different ethnic diverse backgrounds, so they see people that they want to be like, which I think we all recognise is really powerful in volunteering. And one of the things that's helped that government did a good few years ago now, when they introduced V as a volunteering scheme, where there was an opportunity for the corporate sector to match pound for pound with government money, there was then an opportunity that we used to train up these local leaders in how to develop young people as volunteers, because they don't just know how to do it intuitively. Some people are very fortunate and they do, but actually if you're a coach, you maybe don't know how to develop a volunteering pathway for a young person that you're working with. And so investment in that capacity, so in the diverse leadership of community organisations to grow the future volunteer base is the way that we've done it. We've worked with over 20,000 young people as volunteers over the last 15 years through those organisations we work with locally, and was away with them in residential in October, and the diversity is still fantastic, but only because it's the local role models who are doing that work.
Anything else?
Just finally, I guess, the power of role models is incredibly, it is so powerful, and I think, we see that in terms of athletes and others going into community groups, into schools, and so there's no doubt that improving the number of the workforce and the volunteer workforce in terms of number of disabled people would do that too. And clearly the solutions to that are around ensuring that there's a better understanding, good accessibility, some of those just core principles I've talked about today.
And a structured training route, sort of stuff. Yeah.
I mean, I think a lot of the coming back from my previous life in the Wildlife Trust movement, which is a massive volunteer force as well, but it's the people who might volunteer are always out there. It's the culture, the connection, as you say, the inspiration to go into it, having the capacity often in the voluntary sector to actually operate so that those volunteers can be used and valuable to the community is actually where the sticking point comes. And I think with sport there's been, there are still some cultural issues, so the volunteers that go in, if you go in as a woman, you're often expected to make the tea, not to be on the pitch, and we still need to get over some of those things, but it's not that the will isn't out there. I think we just need to make it a more attractive thing to do and make it feel like a really positive experience, and investment in the likes of StreetGames and others is the sort of way that we can really build that up. Because we do have this incredible voluntary body infrastructure in this country. The voluntary sector is so epic, and if we support it properly, then that interface with the individual volunteers is possible.
Thanks.
Very good. Thank you, Rupa. Well, that brings us...
Just one final one. Emily, you've written really powerfully about this difference between role models in general and parental role models. For example, your own daughter's got involved in football not because of the Lionesses, but because you were participating in football for the first time. Yes. If we had a minister before us and we were making a recommendation, what sort of thing can we say to ministers to say, actually, how do we get more mums involved in sport that then their daughters are going to get involved in?
Yeah, well, I guess thinking about myself, so I've never played football at all, and then find myself the chief executive of London Sport, and got invited to a staff match, so I thought, well, I better have a go. So I had my first go, and I've always been a football fan, and I love watching it, and then played and went, I've got it, I understand this, and then found a local club, which I have to say was quite hard to find, although it did exist only a mile down the road from me, of other like-minded mums and older women who maybe hadn't always grown up playing football, where I went and then inspired particularly my 6-year-old who is playing football now, and she isn't really interested in watching the Lionesses. I've tried to make her, and she just isn't interested. She wants to play, and she's much more interested in talking about my mummy plays football. So we've started on that journey together. I think probably, if speaking to a government minister, it's too easy to think that having a big event like an Olympics or a World Cup will just on its own inspire people to get up and do things. So I'd watched the Lionesses, thought it was incredibly inspiring, and never once thought it was for me. Because these weren't 40-something women who were playing. They're elite athletes, and I don't see any connection there. And actually what it took for me to play was an invitation for someone to say, come and have a go, for it to be incredibly casual, incredibly local, accessible. The club, it's £1 a session. There are no rules, really. Obviously there are a few rules, but we don't...
Cage fighting or football.
But, it's not... No one's got a whistle. There's no referee. It's self-regulated. People don't keep score, and it's a completely different atmosphere from what you might get from a competitive mixed or men's only five-a-side league. And one of the challenges we have is, how do we get these women on the pitch? You know, there's so few facilities that often block booked by men's leagues. It's very hard to start. So those are the sorts of things that we need. And like I think Steph says, some of this isn't really rocket science or that hard. It's how do we use what we have, maybe in a slightly different way.
Sounded like it was about joy.
It was a lot of fun. It is a lot of fun. Yeah, it's a lot of fun. Yeah.
Thank you all so much for joining us today. Can I just ask you all before you go, did we drop the ball at all? Was there any questions that you were hoping that we'd ask you, any points that you wanted to land that you didn't manage to get across? No, everybody's happy. In which case, can we thank you all for your time and for sharing all your insight with us all today? And we're really grateful for you sparing us so much of your morning to help us with our inquiry. Thank you very much.